All right, we are going to talk a bit about the integumentary system. So the integumentary system is basically the skin, which is the majority of the integumentary system, and what we'll spend most of our time talking about, as well as our hair and our nails. So let's take a look at the different functions of the integumentary system. So the very first function of the integumentary system is protection. And so this is protection from microbes, so different bacteria, viruses, from abrasion, so from damaging the underlying tissues if we fall down or we get hit with something. It's protection from heat and from chemicals. So we're protecting our other tissues, so protecting the underlying tissues. From, first we said microbes. So protecting them from microbes like bacteria and viruses, also protecting from abrasion, so from falling or getting hit with something, from heat. So when we are in a very hot environment, our skin, our integumentary system is going to assist in bringing down the temperature of the body, or for a very cold environment, our skin is going to detect that, and it's going to send messages to the body to help increase the temperature of the body. And then also chemicals. So anything that is going to touch the body, our skin is going to be in contact with it first, and then that's going to help to protect the interior tissues, the more sensitive tissues. And the way that we do this, the way that we have this ability to protect is, one, through the use of keratin. And keratin is a very hard protein that we find in the most superficial layer of the skin. So hard protein found in the superficial layer of the skin. So we're going to talk about the different types of cells that make up the skin, but keratin is one of the most important pieces of the integumentary system and as far as how the skin works to protect us. So we have this very hard protein, and in the most superficial layer of the skin, we actually have a buildup of this protein, this buildup of this keratin that makes it a very hard surface. Makes it very difficult for different bacteria to try to get into the body. It's what allows us to fall and then kind of scrape our skin, but not actually get down into where we're having issues with clotting and things like that. It also is what is going to protect from different chemicals. So we have this very hard protein that if a chemical gets on our skin, it has to eat through this hard protein before it gets to something underneath. Another way that we protect ourselves is through our hair. So our hair is going to protect our scalp from injury and sun damage. So from injury and sun damage, since that's kind of the uppermost portion of our body, and it's what's going to be facing the sun most of the time if we're outside and we're walking around, for example. So the hair that's on our heads, on our scalp, is going to protect us from the damaging effects of the sun. Won't be reaching the actual skin, but then also from injury, meaning it gives us a little bit of a softer spot to, if something were to hit the head or if we were to fall down and bump our head, then we have a little bit of protection there from actually damaging the skull and damaging the brain underneath. We also have eyelashes. So eyelashes, we have eyebrows, and then we have ear and nose hair. And all of this is going to protect from foreign materials getting into the body. And so our eyelashes and our eyebrows, for example, if it's a very windy day and we've got lots of dust and different microbes moving around in the environment, the idea is that the eyebrows and the eyelashes are going to help prevent things from getting into the eyes, for example. So the wind is blowing and our eyebrows and our eyelashes are going to catch things. So if you think of maybe a very windy day when it's snowing, for example, you can get snow caught in the eyebrows and in the eyelashes, and that's snow that's not getting into the eyes, so it's protecting the eyes. Also in the ear and in the nose. So when we're breathing things in, we have the hairs in our nose that protect and try to catch foreign materials before they get into the lungs. And the same thing with the ears, little hairs in the ears that are helping to protect from things getting down into the ear and causing some infections or problems in the inner ear. And then lastly, we have the nails. And so the nails are going to provide protection against trauma to the end of the digits. The end of the digits, the fingers and toes. And so this is because we use our fingers and our toes to manipulate things, mostly our fingers, but to manipulate things. And it's important that we have protection for those fingers, those things that are able to sense things and move things around. And our fingers, our digits, are very, very important to the functioning of this body. And so our nails are going to protect against damage to those digits. Another function of the skin is to keep fluid inside of the body. So for keeping fluid inside of the body, that's because we have things like lipids on the surface of the skin that are going to prevent evaporation. So we want to keep all of our fluid inside. Our water is very, very important to all of our chemical reactions. And so we have our layers of our cells of our skin that are going to protect from losing the fluid from our blood and other underlying tissues. But of course our cells in our skin have fluid as well. And so then we have this layer of lipids that are on the surface of the skin that are going to hopefully prevent evaporation from even the cells of the skin. And you may notice that if you wash your hands many, many times throughout a day, they start to get really dried out and maybe even cracked because they're so dry. And that's because you're washing off this fatty layer that are on the hands, and every time you wash that off, then that means that those cells are exposed to the environment and you're evaporating water out of those cells, and they're getting drier and drier and drier over time. So another function of the skin is the synthesis of vitamin D. So our skin is very important to assist in us having vitamin D. The active form of vitamin D is calcitriol. We're going to talk a lot more about calcitriol in later sections. But in order to have vitamin D, we actually have to have activation by the UV light from the sun. So we have an inactive form of vitamin D, and then it is going to get activated by UV light from the sun. And then once it is activated by that UV light, then it's going to be stored in the kidneys. And this actually is very important because it's going to increase calcitriol in the blood. And when we increase calcitriol, or vitamin D, then we are going to increase our blood calcium levels. And this is important because we need calcium for things like contraction of muscle, namely contraction of our heart muscle. So it's important to have high levels of blood calcium, and that's important. We are able to get that through using calcitriol. When we have calcitriol, we can increase blood calcium levels. If we don't have calcitriol, then our blood calcium levels may not be where we need them to be, and therefore our functioning of our heart may not be where we want it to be. So the next function of the skin is to protect from UV damage. And we have already kind of talked about protection, and we did talk about kind of the general functions of protection from heat and chemicals. But this is even more specific because we're talking specifically about types of cells that we're going to look at. And we do this by absorbing. So we absorb the UV light waves by melanin. So the melanin that is actually in our melanocytes, this molecule here, melanin, is going to absorb the UV light waves. And when it absorbs the UV light waves, then those light waves are not going to get into the interior of the body. UV light waves are actually very damaging. They're a type of radiation. It's non-ionizing radiation, but it does damage proteins, it damages DNA, it damages RNA, so it's very important to protect our body from UV damage. And so we have high amounts of melanin in our skin to protect us from damage from that ionizing or non-ionizing radiation. Another function of the skin is regulation of body temperature. So our body temperature is going to be regulated by sweating, for example. So if it is a very, very hot day out and we're outside and we're moving around, or even if it's not a hot day but we're running and our body temperature is increasing, then we have glands on our skin that are going to allow us to sweat. And when we sweat, this is going to be putting a layer of water on the surface of the skin. When we put a layer of water on the surface of the skin, that allows the heat to move from the tissues, from the skin, for example, which has then come from other tissues. It's going to allow that heat to be transferred into the water. Water has a high specific heat, which means that it takes a lot of heat to change the temperature of the water before it evaporates. And so we can take a lot of the heat in the body and put it into the water on the surface of the skin, and then when that water evaporates, it takes the heat with it. So sweating is important to bring down the body temperature. So decrease the body temperature. And we can also adjust our blood flow. So we can adjust our blood flow through vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So if we are dilating our blood vessels, that means that we are making them wider. So we have an increase in blood flow. Increase in blood flow. And if we have an increase in blood flow, that's also going to go along with sweating. So if it's really, really hot, our blood vessels will actually go to the surface of the skin, closer to the surface of the skin, and then they're going to get wider. They're going to have more blood flow. And this is because we are bringing the heat from the inside of our body, from the torso area, deep inside the body, bringing it to the more superficial regions of the body and the skin. And when we do this, then what we're doing is we're bringing the heat from the inside, bringing it to our skin so that we can then transfer that heat into the sweat, into the water that we put on the surface of the skin. On the other hand, we can have vasoconstriction, which is making it smaller. So if we're making our blood vessels smaller, we're constricting them, we're decreasing the blood flow. So our body, if we're in a cold situation, will actually pull the blood vessels a little bit closer to the inside of the body, and that will constrict blood flow to our superficial areas, to the outermost or superficial layers of the skin, so that it can keep the heat in the body, so that we're not losing the heat to the exterior. And then it's going to redirect our blood to keep it closer inside the body and make sure that our brain and our heart continues to work. So another function of the skin is excretion. So excretion and absorption. So excretion and absorption, so we're able to eliminate different substances in sweat. So if we have any toxins, we can get rid of some of the toxins in our sweat. That will just go into the sweat glands and will leave through the sweat and then be evaporated, so that can be lost in that way. We can also absorb some lipid-soluble materials and also toxic substances through the skin. So we're able to absorb lipid-soluble substances and toxins. And this is because, again, we have that layer of lipids on the surface of the skin. So we're putting oils out on the surface of the skin to prevent evaporation of our fluids. We want to keep the fluids inside the body. But at the same time, what this does is it gives us this lipid layer, and if we have any lipid-soluble substances, we can put those on the surface of the skin, and they can be absorbed through that lipid layer and then through the plasma membrane, which is also able to bring in nonpolar molecules or lipid-soluble substances and get them into the cells. Of course, then this happens with toxins that are lipid-soluble or nonpolar toxins. So if we get that on our skin, it can be absorbed through the skin as well. Another function of the skin, kind of a last little function of the skin, is to alert the immune system to invaders. So alert the immune system. And we can alert the immune system because we have what are called Langerhans cells in the skin. So we have Langerhans cells that are throughout the skin, and these are going to send information to the immune system. So this is part of one of our first defenses. We have the skin, and then if we have a bacteria that's on the skin, and that bacteria is going to start kind of eating through those first cells, trying to get into the body so that it can make copies of itself and have an infection and keep living. We actually have Langerhans cells, which are part of the immune system, that if a bacterium is coming through, these Langerhans cells are going to pick up on that, and then they're going to send that information to the immune system so we can start to mount a response to that bacteria right away. So that's the last function that we are going to talk about in regards to the integumentary system. So first we talked about protection, then we talked about keeping our fluids inside, our synthesis of vitamin D, protection from UV damage, regulation of body temperature, excretion and absorption, and then alerting the immune system. So now let's take a look at the skin. So this is an image of the skin with various portions of it labeled for us. So the skin is also called the integument. That's why it's the integumentary system. So the skin is the integument, or the skin. It can also be called the cutaneous membrane. So the integument, the cutaneous membrane, we'll put skin up here. So this is the largest organ of the body. Largest organ of the body, and that's because it is made up of a living layer of cells. So you can see here we actually have these different layers, and all of these different layers are composed of cells. So living cells. It also has receptors. It also has vessels. So you can see here, you can see some blood vessels and some lymph vessels right here. And then we have different things like the Pacinian Corpuscle here. The Pacinian Corpuscle is part of a receptor. It's a different type of receptor that we'll talk about. And so we have all of these different things going on in the skin. It's a living organ. Lots of things are happening in the skin. We have the three different layers. So our first layer is the epidermis. You can see that it's labeled here. This is our most superficial layer, the epidermis. And you can see it's a relatively small layer, especially compared to the next layer, the one that is deep to the epidermis, which is called the dermis. So this is our deep tissue. Now, technically, the skin is comprised of the epidermis and the dermis. And that's why we have this dermis part of both of these names. Now, the third layer that we talk about it because it really does closely relate to the epidermis and the dermis, but it's really just seen as a connective tissue, a connective layer that allows the skin to connect to the rest of the body. We are going to talk about it in the skin, however. So we have the epidermis, which is most superficial, and then we have the deeper dermis of the skin. And then below that, we have what's called the hypodermis. It's also called the superficial fascia, and it's also called the subcutaneous layer. So sub meaning below, and then cutaneous is related to the skin, so below the skin layer. So this is and that's why it's subcutis, which is the Latin shortened version there. But the hypodermis, subcutaneous layer, superficial fascia. And so this is also a very thick layer here, made up of lots of connective tissue and various vessels and things that we'll talk about. So just keep in mind, it's not technically part of the skin, but we are going to include it in our skin discussion. So why don't we take a closer look at each of these three different layers here. So the first one that we are going to talk about is the most superficial layer, which is the epidermis. So our epidermis is, of course, in contact with the external environment. In contact and this is because it is the most superficial layer, so one that's on the most outside of the body, so it's in contact with our external environment. It takes about 4 weeks from cell division to it being sloughed off. So as we're making our cells, we'll be making the cells of the epidermis, and we'll make that at a little bit of a deeper layer. And then as these cells are being made, as we're duplicating cells a little bit of the deeper portion of the epidermis, they're going to be moving more superficially. And as they do that, it then, once it gets to the most superficial portion of the skin, which is the top of the skin, right, then they are going to be sloughed off, meaning they're going to eventually fall off because they die. And that takes about 4 weeks. From cell division to sloughed off. And so the way that this works is the cells are pushed superficially. One layer to the next. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get an image in here to show you these different layers. So here is our image. We can talk about the epidermis and the dermis. So this is just showing the epidermis and the dermis here. And then, of course, we do have the lower layer here, the subcutaneous layer, the hypodermis, as it were, as well. But what we have this kind of zoomed in area is the epidermis, and we're going to take a look at these cells here. So as I mentioned, we have this kind of deeper layer of cells that is going to undergo cellular division. So we're making copies of these skin cells, and then over time they're going to be pushed more superficially. So I think I'll scoot this over a little bit. And so this layer of cells here, these are the basal cells. This layer is where we have cellular division. So these cells stay here as basal cells, and they're going to make copies of themselves. So they are going to make copies, and when they do, that copy is going to be more superficial. So this is superficial up here, and this is deep here. And so these basal cells are going to make copies of themselves. So we have lots of basal cells here, and they're going to make a copy of themselves. When they do, that copy goes more superficial. It goes up above it. Now, this basal layer here, why don't I go ahead and I'll keep these as red cells. These are the basal layer cells. Now, these red cells are going to stay there, and now they're going to make another copy of themselves. So these cells that they already made a copy, or the first copy, are going to be pushed up because these cells are going to be making another copy that's going to push them out of the way. And by pushing them out of the way, I mean it's going to be pushing them up further. So when these cells make their next copy, then we have the cells that, the copies that they first made are going to be pushed up one. And then this is going to continue happening. These will be pushed up again when they undergo cell division again, and then be pushed up again, and then be pushed up again, and then be pushed up again, over and over and over again, until we reach the top. At this point, they look kind of like this instead, and then they are dead. They're completely filled with keratin, and then they're going to be sloughed off. So they'll be just fall off naturally or be scraped off during washing when you're taking a bath or a shower, or even just simple things like putting on clothes or brushing up against someone. So we're going to be losing these skin cells. And again, it takes about 4 weeks. So from this basal layer, when we make our first copy, all the way to the most superficial layer where we have these dead cells, it takes about 4 weeks for that to happen. All right, so some more characteristics of the epidermis. One is that it is avascular. Avascular, A means without, and then vascular is related to vessels. So without vessels, meaning there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. So there's no blood flow to the cells of the epidermis. What this means is that all of our nutrients, so our nutrients, meaning things like glucose that we need, or other ions that we need, or even things like oxygen, are going to diffuse from the dermis. So this means that we do have blood flow in the dermis region here, and then that blood flow, we're going to have all of the nutrients be moving more superficially and get into the cells here of the epidermis. And that's important because there are no blood cells, or blood vessels rather, in the epidermis itself. So we actually do have some blood vessels that are right up very, very close to the epidermis. They're not really indicated well here. You can see kind of the spidery veins here, but they're going to be moving into the cells via diffusion, facilitated diffusion, regular diffusion, active transport, depending on what we're moving into the cells of the epidermis. As we saw, the epidermis is a multi-layered epithelial tissue. Oops. Multi-layered epithelial tissue. And we're going to talk more about the different types of cells, but the majority of the cells that make up the epidermis is keratinized, or are keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. What that means is this first one, keratinized, means that it becomes filled with keratin. It makes keratin, and we're going to talk more about that. These are our keratinocytes, so it makes lots and lots of keratin. The next term, stratified. Stratified means many cells. So it's not a single layered, but it's many, many layers. And then the next term, squamous, are single, rounded, flat type cells. So we have many layers of flat, round cells that are filled with the protein keratin. So keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium, that's a type of tissue. And so when we take a look at the different types of cells, we're going to look at the 4 types of cells that we see in the epidermis. So the 4 types of cells that we're going to look at, let's see, 4 types of cells are, 1, the most abundant, are the keratinocytes. The second are the melanocytes. And then we also have the Langerhans cells. And then lastly, the basal cells. And we're going to take a look at each of these different types of cells individually. So first, let's take a look at the keratinocytes. We're going to move over here so that we can keep taking a look at this image here. So we have the keratinocytes. Now again, these are the most abundant of the cells. And when we're talking about the keratinocytes, really what we're talking about are all of these cells that you see here. These are all keratinocytes here. So if we're talking about the epidermis going from here to here, you can see that it makes up the majority of the epidermis. The keratinocytes, as their name implies, they produce the fibrous protein keratin. And so this is a hard protein, and it fills the cell as it moves more superficially. So when we look at this image, perhaps you notice that we have our basal cells here at the bottom, the basal cells here, which are undergoing cell division, as we mentioned, and then we have our keratinocytes that are more superficial. And if you look at these first keratinocytes down here, they're nice and round, and as they move more superficially, now we've gotten into things that are not quite so round. They're more kind of scaly or flattened. And that's because over time they're being more and more filled with this protein keratin. So down here close to the basal layer there's not as much keratin within the cell, but as it's moving more superficially over time it's producing keratin. It's making lots and lots of keratin. As it makes lots and lots of keratin, what that does is it fills the cell with the keratin and it starts to kill off the other organelles. Basically they start to not work as well. And so then the cell starts to become non-functional, and at the end, when we get to the most superficial layer, the cell has actually died. It's not able to go through the cellular processes that it did before because it's so filled with keratin. Now this is actually a good thing. It's a very, very hard protein, and the reason that we do this is because on these most superficial layers then we have these really hard dead cells, so that if a bacterium comes along and it wants to try to get into the skin, it's going to have a really hard time. It's like building a wall on the top of our cells that's filled with this really hard kind of cement. At this point, however, then since they are dead, they're not going through any functions or any processes, and then they can easily be sloughed off. And that's also a good thing, because if the bacteria is on here and it's attached to these cells trying to get inside, and then we slough off these cells, oftentimes we slough off the bacteria with it as well. And so we'll get rid of the bacteria that's trying to get into the body or any other dust or particles that are attached to our superficial cells and get rid of those. Another thing that keratinocytes do is they produce lamellar granules. So lamellar granules. What lamellar granules are these lipids that we talked about. So this is a water repellent sealant. So we talked about how we have these lipids that are on the surface of the cell here, and the function of the lipid is to try to keep the fluids in the body. It also gives us a nice layer of protection, so something else that bacteria have to try to get through. So it's going to decrease water loss, so decrease that, and also decrease water entrance as well. So we don't want to completely adjust or mess up our water balance by getting too much fluid in, so it kind of keeps fluid out and also keeps fluid in. And then it also, as we mentioned, inhibits foreign invaders, so, or foreign materials. So these lamellar granules are very helpful. So that kind of summarizes our keratinocytes, which make up the majority of our epidermis, the most superficial layer. The next most abundant cell that we are going to talk about are the melanocytes. So the melanocytes are going to extend between the keratinocytes. And this right here, I kind of marked off the thing. If we look at the image, this is an example of a melanocyte. Now you can see it has kind of projections that are going to go in between the cells and go in between the keratinocytes. So we actually have more. This is just an illustration of a single one for simplicity, but we have lots of melanocytes that are going to be stretching out their long projections, making these long projections going in between all these different keratinocytes. And the melanocytes, their main function is to produce melanin. So they're producing melanin, and we already mentioned that melanin is going to absorb UV light. So we are producing melanin, so if you look at the image over here, if we're producing melanin here in the cell body, we can put this melanin in the projections here. Now, if you can imagine these projections continuing on, let's say they go even further, and they're filled with melanin, then as the UV light is coming down and it's going to be hitting these keratinocytes, of course it hopefully wouldn't go this far in, but then it's going to be bumping into the melanin here of the melanocyte. And then it'll be absorbed at this point rather than getting further down into the skin, damaging these basal cells or damaging any further deeper into our tissue here. So they absorb our UV light, which protects from DNA damage. So I'm going to move over here a little bit. So this is going to protect from DNA damage. I guess that would be another part of produces melanin here. Melanin also contributes to skin color. So there are different types of melanin, and the different types of melanin that are produced, depending on the quantities of those different types of melanin, is going to assist in skin color. And lastly, our melanocytes can transfer melanin to the keratinocytes. So we have these long projections that are filled with melanin, and not only are these long projections going to be stopping the UV damage from getting into the cells that are deeper, they can actually transfer the melanin to the keratinocytes. And then the keratinocytes are actually going to utilize this melanin, and they're going to create a wall around the nucleus to protect the nucleus from UV light, to protect the DNA from UV light. So once that is transferred, it creates a wall of melanin around the nucleus. A wall of melanin around the nucleus to protect from UV light / DNA damage. So if we go back to our image over here, so again, these projections are going to have melanin in them, and then they're going to transfer that melanin over here, and I believe that's what this image is showing here with these dark dots here. So they'll create these little walls around the nucleus to try to protect them from any UV light that's going to come in, and then it'll absorb the UV light rather than damaging the actual DNA that's inside of the nucleus. The next type of cell that we're going to talk about are the Langerhans cells. So we'll briefly mention the Langerhans cells. Remember that the Langerhans cells are going to assist in the immune response against microbes. So they are going to help other immune cells recognize an invading microbe and then destroy it. So they assist in recognition. So they assist in the recognition of these different microbes. So again, if a bacteria is coming in, they're going to assist. They're going to say, this is the bad guy. It's going to display that on that cell and tell the immune system, this is what the bad guy looks like. Let's mount an immune response. Go out and get the guy that looks like this. However, the Langerhans cells are easily damaged by UV light. So this is why being in UV light is so damaging, or one of the reasons that it's so damaging to our skin, is that we do have this nice first defense here. It's not technically a first defense, but this defense of Langerhans cells, the immune system response right there on the skin, so that if a bacterium's on the skin and it's trying to get further into the body, then we have these Langerhans cells that can tell the system, and the system can come and get the bad guys before they get in and do more damage. Now, if we are outside in the sun a lot, then that UV light can come in and can damage them pretty easily. We do, of course, have the melanocytes and the keratinocytes to try to help protect from the UV damage, but the Langerhans cells themselves don't have melanin to try to protect from the damage. And so they are very, very easy to be damaged. And then what that means is that our skin no longer has that protection. So even if you go out and you get a bit of sun, not even to where you're severely burned or anything, but if you can tell that you've gotten sun that day, say your skin's a little bit pink, likely you've damaged your Langerhans cells. And if you've done that, then if you get some sort of bacteria on your skin, it's more likely that it'll end up as an infection if you didn't have the sunburn or the slight change due to the sun, because you've likely damaged those Langerhans cells. So the last cell that we're going to talk about, the fourth cell, are the basal cells. And this is, again, we're talking about the epidermis. So this is in the deepest layer of the epidermis. And we saw that in the image. And so our basal cells are actually stem cells. And they are stem cells in that they self-replicate, and then they can differentiate into the keratinocytes. So they self-replicate, and then they can differentiate into keratinocytes. And we saw that in the image. So we saw that layer of basal cells at the bottom, the most deep layer of the epidermis here. So you can see this nice darker pink layer of basal cells. These are the stem cells that are going to continuously replicate. And so then they're making this layer of cells above them, and then, of course, once this layer of cells is made, they're going to just continuously replicate. So then they'll make the next layer of cells, pushing this layer of cells more superficially. And then, as they have made copies of themselves, at this point, then they turn into what we call keratinocytes that we've already discussed. All right, so we are going to finish this lecture here. We've talked about the functions of the skin. So we've talked about, first of all, what the integumentary system is, the skin, the hair, the nails. We talked about the different functions of the integumentary system here. Then we took a look at an image of the skin, and we have discussed in more detail the aspects of the epidermis, as well as more specifically the different types of cells of the epidermis.